Owens, my brother, and I were lodging in a cabin in northern Montana. It was hidden amid the trees, in a depression between the mountains. This trip was quite normal for my brother Johnny and I because we both loved the outdoors and spent time exploring, hiking, and hanging out in the woods. We took it leisurely on the first day due to the travel, spending time at the cabin and taking in the view without doing much outside of it. Around 5:30, I believe, Johnny made the decision to take a stroll before nightfall. He went out and said, "All right," but I didn't really listen and simply glanced at him. I could tell he was only going for a little trip because he didn't have a backpack or anything. I reclined and relaxed on the couch by the hearth. After doing the most of the driving earlier, I was so tired that I was hardly conscious. But when the sun sank below the mountains, the cabin gradually grew darker. I didn't realize Johnny hadn't returned until the cabin was only lit by the fireplace, and it was definitely too dark to be moving around motionless without any equipment. I leapt to my feet, gathered my day pack, a flashlight, and a headlamp, and went out to check on him. My initial assumption was that we were in bear country. I was a little anxious that Johnny would encounter one in the country, but as the road led me farther into the woods, my anxiety changed to one that was more likely. I continued having terrible scents, which caused me to repeatedly glance behind me, though I was expecting someone to be there. But I never saw anything. After 10 minutes on the trail, I noticed Johnny approaching me. Although he wasn't running or anything, he appeared anxious and was moving really swiftly, as if he were attempting to flee from something. At the same moment, we both began speaking. He was trying to convince me to turn around and get back to the cabin when I asked him what was happening. Finally, we simply began to walk quickly back, and once we were inside, he told me he saw someone in the trees watching him. He claimed that the man had an eerie appearance, and that it appeared as though he was being stalked as he continued to go along the trail. Johnny reasoned that the man might have followed him and he had just returned to the cabin during the day. He therefore waited till nightfall, but Johnny assured me it was probably nothing and that he wasn't sorry, just wanting to be safe, presumably because he was the bigger brother. I tried not to worry about it because I trusted him. The man he saw was most likely hiking or simply had a cabin nearby. After preparing dinner, we relaxed on spending the remainder of the night over a campfire on the front porch. Although neither of us acknowledged it, I believe we were both attempting to keep an eye out for anyone seeing us. As the night wore on, the mountains grew quieter. We stayed up talking by the campfire, went inside later, and slept until the next morning. We had a quick breakfast before packing our bags and heading off on the region's famous climb, which takes around 6 hours to reach the top of one of the mountains. After that, we were both really tired. The final hour of the hike back to the cottage seemed to drag on forever. Johnny stated he was going to take a shower and threw his suitcase down before heading inside. I sat on the couch to wait. I had to wait for him because the cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom. However, I had only been lying there for a minute when I suddenly remembered the man my brother had mentioned yesterday. Almost expecting to see him outside, I stood up and peered out the windows. I returned to the couch, but suddenly I felt like something was off. After a few more minutes of trying to figure out what I was experiencing, I realized that the annoying sound of the shower's water pump hadn't started yet. Johnny, no answer. I rose and made my way to the bedroom down the hall. I called his name once again as I knocked on the door. As I reached down and cracked open the door, I sensed an uncomfortable sensation. I cautiously opened it, perhaps only a few inches, and saw Johnny standing between the door and the crack. In the corner of the room, he was kneeling with his eyes wide open, staring at me, and gently shaking his head no, as if to signal me to leave. His eyes were filled with such unsettling terror that I can still vividly recall it. It's a terrible sight that I hope I never have to witness again. A man was standing a few feet away from him when I pulled the door open all the way. His eyes were wide, too, but in an unsettling, weary manner. He had long black hair that was oily, and his clothes were ripped and unkempt. I didn't have time to think at the time. My quick, unfiltered response was to stop him. After charging at him, I saw him lift a rifle from his side barely a few paces away. When I tackled him, Johnny knew what to do right away. He was largely subdued after we wrestled the gun away from him. I can assure you that this man was savage, yelling, screeching, and attempting to escape by scratching. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, nor was he slowing down. Therefore, figuring out exactly how to get out of this took some time. We chose Johnny, who would be restrained, while I prepared the automobile because he was much larger than me. I swiftly followed his instructions and threw our bags into the car, which was already filled with everything we had brought from our most recent hike. I then started the automobile and prepared it. I returned inside, and we made an effort to restrain him using anything we could find lying around the cabin, just enough to allow us to escape. Of course, we also brought the gun. As we drove away, we could hear him yelling from inside the cabin. We alerted the police once we were in service, but by the time they arrived at the cabin, the man had vanished and all the scraps we used to tie him up were scattered across the floor. My brother claimed that he was taken completely by surprise and restrained at gunpoint as he entered the room to take a shower, was instructed to summon me to the room. I walked in despite my brother's refusal, knowing that he would be giving me no chance if he did. I tackled the guy, and we still joke about how crazy that was. I just don't know how to describe it. However, it might have been the reason we survived that cabin. Now, the gun we provided the police is the only hint they have about the man's identity. After determining its registered owner, they discovered that it belonged to a man who had been missing for 5 years and lived roughly 50 miles distant from where we were. However, based on our description of the attacker's appearance, it was likely someone else, which makes us assume that the guy who assaulted us also attacked the gun owner, leaving him unaccounted for. That could have also been my and Johnny's fate, if things had gone any other way. Music, any other way. Music. Music by PL. I visited my father's former cottage in 2016, his hometown, which was no longer even a town, but rather a series of dilapidated buildings and shops along a deserted road, was 6 hours distant in the forests outside of it. He claimed there was no incentive to visit his cabin when the town was gone, so we would never really go there, although he thought it would be good to go down there and see the house he had constructed after he died. Since I anticipated it would be in terrible condition, I wanted to restore it as much as I could in order to keep it intact and maintain it for as long as possible. If nothing else, I thought the trip would help me relax and get some fresh air. After driving to the village and parking behind one of the abandoned gas station buildings, I hiked the 2 meters uphill track, which was narrow, rough, and windy. I brought the necessary tools and all of my hiking equipment. I was ready to spend the night in a tent if necessary, because I had a sneaking suspicion that it might have already fallen, fortunately. However, the cabin was still there when I returned from the lengthy hike through the woods. It was a simple rectangular log home with greenery and vines creeping up the outer walls, situated in a little clearing among the trees. Upon entering, I discovered that the door was unlocked and that the interior was in really poor condition. There was trash all throughout the place, and the room smelled musty and bad. Though it didn't appear to be recent, it was obvious that someone had noticed this location wasn't in use at some point and had most likely been here, perhaps for some time. For a few years or so, there were no indications of anything. I created a level area for my belongings by moving everything I could into the room's corner. I unrolled my sleeping bag and simply nestled in, as the sun had already begun to drop. I should add that even though I didn't see or hear anything that night, I was unable to sleep for more than half an hour at a time before experiencing an odd, unsettling sensation that woke me up. It resulted in a very unpleasant evening. Groggy and questioning whether this entire journey was a mistake, I woke up at sunrise. After making coffee on my tiny camping stove, I went for a walk in the woods to decompress. The sun was just beginning to peek over the trees, and it was still rather dark. I discovered a hill-like overlook a short distance in where I could see above the tree line. I thought it would be a wonderful spot to see the sunrise. However, I discovered something else. Up there, I could see the deserted town. There was a light, but it was far away. It seems to have been taken from a building window. At that distance, I couldn't determine if it was coming from a store or a residence, and a minute later, it abruptly shut off. I was a little concerned about my automobile, but overall I was really shocked that there were other people here. It was probably nothing to be concerned about. Simply a few urban explorers exploring the town. Even so, it was a huge coincidence. After an hour of sitting on the hill and watching the sunrise, I started working on the cabin by walking back through the woods. Cleaning and restoring the exterior was the first step. However, I must admit that I continued to get the same sensation I did at night when I was working outside. This ominous feeling hovered over me whenever I turned to face the trees. It took me some time to fully comprehend what I was feeling, but in the end, I was able to identify what I believe it to be. I sensed that I was not alone. I continued to work, but I kept checking my shoulder. There was really no chance that anyone else was out here. Not possible. Yes, the deserted town, but just a dilapidated cabin in some random woods. I assumed that there must have been some reason why I was tense. I went inside to test out the old wood stove as the sun was setting. It warmed the cabin and fired up without any issues, giving the impression that these things were unstoppable. I sat close to it and just listened to the crackle of the flames while I contemplated everything. This journey, my dad, life in general. Later in the evening, however, a similar sound abruptly accompanied the crackles in the flame. There were crunching sounds and cracks emanating from the cabin's front. I listened with my head turned. All I could make out was that it was unquestionably a person and not a wild animal. I was unable to listen closely to whatever the hell was outside the cabin, since the wood stove felt like it was 1,000 times louder, just as they were approaching the front door. My entire world momentarily stopped when they knocked and yelled a name. My dad's name was called out by the man. I got up and walked up to the opposite side of the door in utter disbelief. If it had just grabbed hold of me. How was my dad known to him? I couldn't help but shout out and inquire about his identity. Outside, the man paused. After I spoke, I believe he realized I wasn't my father. The man who constructed this cabin is an old acquaintance of mine. I hope to see him once more. The unidentified man said something. As I approached the door, I felt the impulse to open it, so I could talk to someone about my dad and hear all of his stories. Still, I was unable to open it for some reason. Why had he come here at all? The man told me he lived in that old town when I asked. I gave it some thought before revealing that I was the son of the man he was trying to find. He and my dad had it. The man at the door hesitated. Kid, I'm really sad to hear that. I would have liked to see him again. At first, hearing it was pleasant, but I soon realized there was something strange about the manner he delivered it. There was something about his voice. I wasn't prepared for someone who had recently learned of the death of a friend to feel so depressed. He seemed to know I was giving it too much thought before I could say anything. The man went on speaking. Why don't you talk to me and open up? Son, it's freezing outside. It would be pleasant to share that blaze. He spoke extremely slowly, but there was a sense of hurry or impatience in his voice. I had the uneasy feeling that he wasn't telling the truth, and that he might not be who he claimed to be. Although he was in the town where my dad used to reside, and knew his name, how could I be certain that he was actually a friend of his? Even yet, I was at a loss for words as I continued to think. The man asked me to open up again during my pause. A little harsher. He knocked on the door once more. His tone became harsher and more demanding. I retreated a few paces from the door. Open the door. Kid Dot, will you leave me to perish here in the cold? Would your father want you to do that? As I reached into my rucksack for my hunting knife, my heart started to race. The man abandoned the phony persona of a nice, harmless buddy and kept banging on the door and shouting veiled threats. This continued for a lot longer than I could remember. It seemed to go on forever, like an unending nightmare. Then, out of rage, the man punched the door, and then there was the sound of his footsteps as he left, returning to the woods. I waited in terror all night long, my mind racing. However, when the sun rose, and there were no indications of him around, I grabbed my bags quickly and fled the cabin. I was really fortunate to see my automobile undamaged and safely concealed behind the dilapidated gas station. I ran out of town and returned home by car. I honestly still have a lot of questions after that trip. Even though I had hoped to gain some answers or come to grips with things, I came to the realization that I had never truly understood my dad's motivation for leaving. I think there was more to it now, and perhaps there were other reasons why he had never brought me back to his cabin. But I suppose I had assumed it was because the town was dying off and everyone else was leaving. I don't know how he even knew my dad there, why he was still there, or what he truly wanted from me. Everything. But it seems to me that he wasn't acting with any good motives that evening. I honestly doubt I ever would have left that place if I had allowed my feelings to overcome me and opened the door to let him in. By unidentified, this occurred back in 2014, when I was taking a year off from college to drive around the United States. My cousin invited me to stay at his cabin, which is located just south of the Appalachian Mountains. When I arrived on the East Coast, I accepted the offer, as I knew it would be convenient to have a real location to stay and rest for a few days. The cabin was also pleasant. To be honest, it was much more like a vacation house, unquestionably a more contemporary cabin than usually found in the center of woodlands or small log homes. When I saw it, I must admit that I was a little taken aback that my cousin allowed me to stay there for free. I spotted someone observing me as I started to move a lot of items from my car inside the cabin, and then walked back outside to get whatever was left over. They were standing far from the path in the trees, and since he could only see me in the house, he had to be staring at me. However, I didn't know the area, so perhaps they weren't attempting to be weird. I had no idea that there might have been houses and cottages all around here, hidden away behind the trees. The man was still outside, facing the cabin, when I got the rest and locked my car and brought it inside. Shut the door. In addition to informing my cousin that I got in safely, I also texted him to let him know that I was being watched. I simply asked him if he had any idea who it might be. I was unpacking when he texted me back, but I didn't remember to check it until over an hour later, well after the sun had fallen. According to my relative, the cabin was situated on 40 acres of his land, which was completely fenced off. There should have been no other people out there. That instantly made my feelings about what I had witnessed even worse. Before, I didn't really give a damn, but now that they were on the property, it seemed kind of weird. Simply gazing at me from a distance. I stepped outside to look again, but it was completely dark outside, save for the cabin's lights. Even the tree iron was out of my line of sight. Everything was in utter darkness. As I drew the curtains, it chilled me. I rested in the bedroom and watched a movie in an attempt to decompress. My mind was kept busy by the movie, but it didn't entirely ease the feeling. A little over an hour into it, I caught a glimpse of something. My gaze was fixed on the window with the opening in the curtains. I thought I might have just caught a glimpse of something moving over there, but now all I could see was the darkness behind it and my hazy reflection on the glass. I hurriedly stood up and headed in its direction when I heard footsteps running through the grass. By the time I reached the window, I was unable to see anything and could only hear the faint sound of footfall moving deeper into the darkness. I called my cousin right away. I don't know why I didn't call the police right away, but my cousin advised me to, so I did just that, and a minute later, the police were on their way. The officer arrived at the cabin in a reasonable period of time, considering how far away it was. But the man who had been had long since stopped watching me, and we both quickly came to the conclusion that there wasn't anything he could do about it. Unless the man returned and stayed long enough for the officer to return, he was unable to search the woods or do anything else. I was therefore abandoned once more. For the remainder of that evening, I was unable to get rid of the uneasy feeling I was experiencing. I had the option to leave, but to be honest, the idea of carrying everything to the car and making the journey back and forth from the cabin in the dark was more unnerving than simply locking myself inside. Naturally, despite the fact that I could see nothing at all, I couldn't stop staring out the windows. For the final hour before going to bed, I was simply pacing the home, making sure everything was in working order, and trying to feel more secure about going to bed at what must have been 12 or 1 a.m. It was unavoidable, but I believe I was just delaying it as much as possible. I needed to sleep. I went to the bedroom and shut myself in, after turning off all the lights in the cabin. After hoping that the worst was over, I went to bed and fell asleep half an hour later. I woke up way too early for it to be appropriate, way too early, since the sun hadn't risen yet. It must have been about 4 a.m., indicating that I had barely slept for a couple of hours. My mind instantly returned to that panic state, and I felt compelled to inspect the cabin once more. I had to take a walk around to make sure I was still okay before I could sleep again. After turning on the hallway light and getting up, I paused to listen. The only sound I could hear was the strong wind pelting the cabin's tiny windows. I only made it halfway down the stairs before I heard another sound. On the end of the cabin, it sounded like a couple of thumps. I was aware that the end included a kitchen and the tiny library-style space dot. As I drew closer, I could make out the silhouette of someone moving close to the end through the hallway lights. I wanted to deny the reality of my predicament, so I froze, but the shadow abruptly stopped moving. A few seconds passed. After that, it began to move slowly once more before a figure emerged at the end of the corridor. I could tell from the figure's shape that it was the same man who had been observing me from the trees. I locked myself back in the bedroom after turning around. The ensuing hush was deafening. I assumed he would try to attack me, chase me, or even smash the door, but there was only silence. My heart was beating, and I could hear it. The man simply stood there while a few slow footsteps came down the corridor and up to the other side of the door. I gripped my phone tightly, wanting to call for assistance, but I was afraid he may hear me and decide to expedite whatever he had planned. Therefore, I decided to grab my keys, open the window, and sprint from my car instead. I climbed in and drove out of the cabin. When police finally arrived, they discovered no one. The man had come in through a broken lock window at the far end. It's unclear if he broke it or if it was already broken. However, the police also discovered the bedroom door unlocked. It was simply one of those common pushpin locks. In any case, that indicated the man was ready to open the door and would do so at any moment. Therefore, I wouldn't have been able to leave so simply if I had tried to wait for the cops there. The strangest thing is that he was there as soon as I got to the cabin, which probably suggests he had been keeping an eye on it for some time, possibly waiting for me or someone else to show up. I was fortunate to understand what he truly intended. Didn't need to learn.